News just coming through to Newsroom says the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, the NMDPRA, wishes to inform the general public, it's a statement credited to the agency, that limited quantity of premium motor spirit, or PMS, commonly known as petrol, with methanol quantities above Nigeria's specification was discovered in the supply chain. The agency says methanol is a regular additive in petrol and usually blended in an acceptable quantity. To ensure vehicular and equipment safety, the limited quantity of the impacted product has been isolated and withdrawn from the market, including the loaded trucks in transit to other parts of the country. The regulatory agency says our technical team, in conjunction with the NNPC and other industry stakeholders, will continue to monitor and ensure quality petroleum products are adequately supplied and distributed nationwide. The source supplier has been identified, and further commercial and appropriate action shall be taken by the authority and NNPC Limited. This statement seemed to conflict. Who actually was responsible for the import of these substandard fuel products that could cause problems to generators and other equipment that are being used? That's the statement currently in the news right now by the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority. That is just issuing the statement, the NMDPRA. Yeah, we're sticking with the Nigeria's oil industry. The country has closed the deals on the Marginal Field Bid Round it conducted back in May of 2021. At the bigger field of play, however, are the international oil majors, some of which are selling down on some of their assets in Nigeria. There's so much to get update on the Nigerian oil sector, as Olufola Wusu, who is the partner and head of oil and gas intellectual property at Megathos Law Practice, joins me live now in the studio. Good evening. You managed to get all the way down here with this fuel scarcity induced by this substandard product. The question is, who did it very well? Well, this statement seemed to absolve the NNPC, because he said the authorities are looking into it. But this is as bad as it can get. Let's start from there first.
I think these are interesting times, first of all, and
very distressing times. Maybe. Maybe you want to rephrase.
I would rather say these are interesting times, and depending on the perspective you want to look from. And Alhaji has given us clear indications that the Dangote refinery should be starting by the third quarter of this year. And so that's a glimmer of hope. But as regards who brought in this quality of fuel, I think it's between the NNPC Limited and the regulators telling us who brought it. And I know for a fact that there are clear companies that do quality control checks on these products. They do it at sometimes even from the port of export. So it's a bit curious that this volume.
NNPC is responsible for nearly 100% of petrol products into Nigeria.
I think it's very curious.
It is the NNPC.
I think it's curious.
That takes about 99% of the total volume coming through. If there's anyone who's going to put in the checks, it's the same regulatory agencies. How this particular type of product went through the checks.
All the checks and balances.
All the checks and balances.
Amazing.
And gets all the way across some cities already, and is on the way to hinterlands. We're just going to be counting the cost. As some of our colleagues are in our news chat box, WhatsApp room, and asking who's going to pay for the damaged cars and the generators.
But that's a fantastic question. So if Nigerians are willing to take the bulls by the horn and go to court, NNPC is now a limited liability company, if I'm correct.
Yes, you're correct.
Under the Petroleum Industry Act that was signed into law by our president. So if they feel so strongly about the damage that has been incurred, they should test it out in the courts.
Interesting. So let's talk about the bid rounds, which was recently concluded. Well, what are your thoughts? Do you think we've finally put a closure to that transaction? So for me, I think that's great news, because if you're doing a SWOT analysis of oil and gas industry in Nigeria, and if you're listing out the strengths, one of the things you're talking about, the $19 billion Dangote refinery, $10 million Energy Train 7 project, $2.5 billion AKK pipeline, and the Marginal Field Bid Round. Because the last time that took place was in 2002, 2003. The one that was meant to take place in 2013 was overtaken by events. So this basically is good news, because it offers Nigerian entrepreneurs within the oil and gas space an opportunity to grow. And I think that basically the philosophy behind the Marginal Field Bid Round is, the thinking was, we need to give Nigerian entrepreneurs some form of opportunity to grow. But looking back in retrospect, they need a bit more than opportunities. They need clear benchmarks. They need clear frameworks that they're going to have to aspire to. Otherwise, it's just be like the 9 players that are succeeding in producing oil and gas from all the others that were awarded licenses. And some of them even had their licenses revoked. Those are players that
were awarded licenses in the 2002-2003 bid round.
Interesting. Okay, hold on there. We have a whole lot more to dig into the marginal oil field and a whole lot more in the conversation with Olufola Wusu when we return. Everyone, stand by. We'll be right back in two. I continue our conversation with Olufola Wusu, who is the partner and head of oil and gas intellectual property at Megathos law practice. Thank you so much. But just very quick, that news coming through about the adulterated petrol in circulation. The Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, NMDPRA, says it has informed the public that limited quantity of the PMS that has been talked about with methanol quantities above Nigeria's specification was discovered in the supply chain, which is, according to the agency, is now being taken out of the system, has been isolated and withdrawn from the market, including those trucks that were loaded and in transit to other parts of the country. The agency, the regulatory body, also said the source supplier has been identified and further commercial and appropriate actions shall be taken by the authority and NNPC Limited. NNPC Limited and oil marketing companies have been directed to sustain sufficient distribution of petrol in all retail outlets nationwide. Meanwhile, the NNPC has intensified efforts at increasing the supply of petrol into the market in order to bridge any unforeseen supply gap. That is a statement credited to the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority. As today, the 8th of February, that's coming through this evening as Nigerians in Lagos, Abuja, and other parts of the country begin to groan under the petrol scarcity due to the substandard petrol products that have been imported into the country. Conversation around the country's marginal fields. You talk about indigenous. You talk about this. Yes, there are 4 oil local firms are bidding for Shell. So move a bit from marginal and go to the big mainstream, where you have big names such as Shell, Seplat, Owando, and others playing ND Western. And some of them, according to sources, are bidding for this $4 billion sort of asset by Shell. Is this good news for marginal field players?
I think it's good news for marginal field players because one of the routes through which an oil and gas company can grow is by acquiring resource-rich assets. And if you look at the history of Nigeria, Shell basically held all the acreage in Nigeria before eventually divested some of it, and some of it was allocated to other IOCs that we currently have. So if you look at the history of acquisitions of Shell assets, those that bought Shell assets have done very well. Seplat is a case in point. Look at the assets that they acquired in Western Delta, OML 38, and all the other OMLs that are very gas rich. So if you're buying Shell assets, I think you're going in the right direction. And we all know the reasons why Shell had to divest some of the assets in the first place.
You tell me.
So basically, there's been a reduction in appetite for risk. And I remember the Shell CEO was saying that they are not so comfortable with having to deal with the community issues and, the kind of backlash that's come from the communities as regards their operations in the Niger Delta. And, some of the assets have now become so iconic, some of the assets that the activists were involved in before they became martyrs. So those are the things that have made some of those assets rather high risk to operate. And basically the reason is that the indigenous operators, because they're Nigerians, would, get a better deal with the communities. And I think that's questionable anyway, because communities are basically agitated and they want a share of the action as well. And if you're looking at CSR that used to be contractual, the PIA has actually made it statutory. So you owe the communities through the host community funds and through the other sections that talk about you doing some level of CSR. And basically there are 2 philosophies for CSR. That's under the contractual regime. There was tokenism, give them some form of inducement. And there was oil and gas or LNG for development, which is actually you take long-term practical steps to develop your host communities. So basically government gives you the freedom to operate, gives you the license to operate. The communities give you the freedom to succeed. That's the reality.
Interesting about how this will actually work out. But when you talk about marginal field, you talk about what due diligence is required.
So due diligence, basically, when you're trying to acquire a marginal field, you're looking at the assets you want to acquire and how viable are they. So maybe you're looking at 10%, 20%. So how many fields will actually give you 10 to 20% returns? Not very many, and that's the reality. So you're looking at assets that are viable, assets that can stand the test of time, assets that you can easily raise financing on. Because it's one thing to have a field development plan, which is great, but to get the financing to develop that field development plan, that's 2. Then 3, look at RJ that took 20 years. Technical partners, financing partners. Those are the issues that you need to look at. So you need to check out that asset very well, and you need to get the people, even if they are retired, I'm sure a lot of them are still alive, get them. If you can bring them on board as consultants, that should actually work.
So funding and technical challenges and partnerships is key to being a marginal field
Those
operator?
are the basic problems and challenges that the marginal field players were constantly having. They were having litigation with their technical partners. I know there were rumors of some of the consortia being nudged to come together. And the reality is, it doesn't matter how watertight an agreement is. If there's no real meeting of the minds, you're probably heading to the Federal High Court. Oh, sorry, the bid round provides for dispute resolution. So you're meant to start with mediation at the Oil and Gas Center. Then you're meant to do arbitration that's in Lagos. But we know in reality, when the chips are down, what Nigerians will do.
Is the marginal field round licensing and all that, is that the solution to Nigeria's underproduction? I
doubt it, because all the marginal field players together would give us maybe roughly 5%. 5%.
Top of 1.6, 1.4 that we're doing?
Maybe 5%.
Maybe 5. Maybe 5. Not so much.
So if we're looking at boosting productive capacity, we should be looking at a real licensing round, deep offshore. The PIA provides for deep offshore gas. For the first time, we can have PSCs for gas. So we should be looking at licensing rounds, unlocking acreage, over 122 if I'm correct, that are lying fallow.
Yes.
Unlocking this acreage, bringing in investors. But the big question is an election year in 2023.
Fingers crossed.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Fingers crossed. Well, what are the benefits of shared infrastructure when you're talking about marginal field operators?
So for shared infrastructure, because marginal field players basically are looking at 10,000 barrels, 15,000 barrels, the PIA defines the marginal field as a field that's been left fallow for 7 years, or a marginal field that's...
I thought it was going to be about up to 100 million barrels.
Not at all.
I'm dreaming.
So basically, they're very small fields. So if you have marginal field players that are lying along the same corridor, and A, B, C company all having to buy barges, let's imagine there's no pipeline. That doesn't make any sense. Like what the banks have done, they set up NIBS and some of the other companies. We should have infrastructure as a service. And that's what we saw for West African gas pipelines. We are seeing a gas pipeline as a service. So for a willing buyer, willing seller, you can feed in your gas. And a seller maybe in Ghana feeds in their gas. A buyer in Lagos takes out the gas. Basically, that was the concept. And that's something that the marginal field players need to look at. So rather than stretching their OPEX and CAPEX, buying barges, laying pipelines, if you fall along the same corridor, you should be looking at coming together, setting up companies that will provide the shared infrastructure services that you need, evacuation of your products, transportation, and things like that. Once you're able to share the costs along this infrastructure that the companies that you all own together, I think that would make a lot more sense rather than having to split your capex.
Well, so are there lessons to be learned from the evolution of Seplat and Owando, which are two ER that we have on this side? Both of them are listed on the exchange, on the NGX, by the way.
I think those are shining stars in my opinion, because if you look at...
But we need more shining stars.
We do, but so if you look at the evolution of Shell started as a family company, Marco Samuel and his two sons. And Shell was selling seashells. No, that's not his tongue twister. They started with selling seashells. Then Marco Samuel died.
That's what's called Shell.
Shell. Really. Then he died and his sons took over. And they did a pivot into oil and gas. They introduced branding. Shell has a separate division for intellectual property. They have a general counsel for intellectual property. How many Nigerian oil and gas companies have intellectual property divisions or even intellectual property lawyers? Shell earns billions of dollars.
You are one, so you know.
So I'm one of them.
Yes.
So Shell earns billions of dollars from licensing intellectual property. So if we're going to grow powerhouses from the marginal field players, we're going to have to be intentional. It's not enough to give Nigerian entrepreneurs access to these assets. It's not enough. We need to be very intentional with government setting clear benchmarks that the players need to meet. So if you look at, say, Owando acquiring the assets of ConocoPhillips, that was a huge pivot for them.
Yes.
And it would have been better if Owando had given a license to the patents for liquefaction technology. That was the foundation for the Brass LNG project. But that didn't quite happen. All they acquired was basically the assets for oil and gas. But even at that helped Owando to pivot and to grow. Because basically, if you're able to do a proper oil and gas business, make a proper profit, and you can finance your expansion or asset acquisition drive, or it makes it easier for you to acquire that financing, you're on the road to success.
Yeah, to sum it up, what are you learning about the FPSO that got burned? Some folks say it's about 100 years old.
I think it's actually for 6 years. And
not 100?
No, I think it's for 6. I think oldest
for 6 years old?
For 6 years. I think
so it's quite old and rickety.
Well, I would call it dated technology. And dated technology.
But it's old, 46.
But so in reality, I think the oldest FPSO in service should be 47. But I don't think that's best industry practice. Egina, the $16 billion project,
yes.
The FPSO was brand new,
yes.
and it should last for maybe 25, 30 years. I think right now regulators should be thinking about setting a benchmark or a cap for the maximum number of years that
you bring in an FPSO.
So I understand the FPSO financing is expensive. That market is huge. Should be 6-7 billion.
It's dangerous if you're going to
I understand that. So in between $300 million to $3 billion, you're looking at buying a brand new FPSO. So in reality, after 20 years or more, some of those vessels are converted into FPSOs, and that's the reality. But we should have clear regulations that says beyond a certain number of years, you cannot bring an FPSO older than X into Nigeria.
There's an age limit.
There should be.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Olufola Wusu, who is a partner head of oil and gas intellectual property at Megathos Law Practice.